Hello and welcome to another episode of Monte's Musings, where we're going to discuss the release of the Los Angeles Valiant's head coach Moon after they went 0-7 in the first stage of Overwatch League 2019 season. Their press release simply states that they have relieved him of his duties as head coach, and that currently Packing 10, their assistant coach, will be an interim head coach, and they are keeping Stoop and Dongsu in their roles as assistant coaches. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, and we'll do some speculation as well. Moon is a very established head coach going all the way back to Mighty AOD, where he coached a couple of players on this roster, particularly Fate and Kariv, back in the Apex days in Korea. He was signed on as the head coach pretty early on in the inaugural season of the Overwatch League after the Valiant decided to relieve their former coach, Cuddles, of his coaching duties. Now, this was part of a large-scale rebuild that the Valiant did at the end of March and early April. So about, halfway through the season of the last season of Overwatch League, where many, many new players were added. Stoop was also brought on board at that time, who will be remaining as an assistant coach. This is a really surprising turn of events because in my many conversations with the Valiant and their ownership, particularly Noah, they really liked Moon. Moon is, I think, a good coach. I think he is a very strong central authority figure from my observations of him interacting with the team and being around the Valiant facility. And they were really dedicated to Moon as a long-term solution as coach. So even though they have performed poorly to this point so far in the season, it was a bit of a surprise to let him go. Now, the overall makeup of the Valiant coaching staff has changed pretty significantly between last season and this one. One of their assistant and strategic coaches, Demon, is now the head coach of the Paris Eternal, and Gunba, another assistant coach from last season, ended up going to the Boston Uprising. So Stoop maintained that position. They added Dongsu, another coach that I believe Moon worked with in the past, and Packing 10 to this roster. And yet they never really got there in terms of the GOATS meta. So what is Moon's coaching style? I've talked about this a lot on my podcast, Oversight with Thorin, and various other mediums. But Moon is a very structure-based coach. He is a coach that has always prized being very good at the meta, being very conventionally good in the way that they focus specifically on the best metagame strats for any particular point in time, and then try and hone those. He really emphasizes teamwork over individual performance, which is pretty solid, I think, in a game like Overwatch that is so teamwork oriented. But at the same time, there isn't a lot of allowance for players to make their own plays, to do their own things. And it really is a top-down, very strict top-down structure where what Moon says goes. And he does, I think, hold himself well in that position. I think he does drive respect from his players a lot of the time, but that may have been breaking down given their poor performance. And I think coming into this season, most people would have thought that this was going to be a great meta for the LA Valiant because GOATS is so focused around team play over individual performance. And I think maybe that's one of the reasons why they are choosing to remove him at this point in time, because a lot of the roster changes, because remember, really, for the most part, the Valiant, they just decided to let players go, right? We saw them releasing, Soon, sending him over to the Paris Eternal alongside Finzi, releasing a lot of their backup players like Numlocked and Verbo and Silk Thread. And they really hadn't made any, I think, significant additions other than Kuki ever since they cleaned house in April of 2018. And Kuki obviously coming in as a backup tank and then switching to support was quite odd, considering that the Valiant had previously made a lot of statements praising Custa's shot-calling abilities when they traded him for Unko to the Dallas Fuel, and really feeling like his shot-calling from the backline was a big difference maker on this roster. And you would think, with a team that values shot-calling so highly and values teamwork so highly, that he would continue to play in that main support role instead of transitioning Kuki from a tank role to one that he doesn't really seem very proficient on when it comes to Lucio play from what we've seen from the season so far. Also, I think if you're looking forward, you could say, well, this should have been a good meta for the Valiant. And so what does a meta look like that's bad for the Valiant? I think right now, if we do head towards a more DPS-focused meta, where a lot of the burden of carrying is going to be left to Kareev, who did play some DPS last season but didn't look amazing, to Agilities, who I think is a middle-of-the-road DPS player. They have Bunny, who can be a good 1v1 Tracer player if Tracer's in the meta, but otherwise hasn't seen a lot of playtime overall. And then to KSF, who has never really come into his own in a stage environment. I think you really have to question how this team would perform if they had to rely on their DPS, which I think may be the question that the Valiant were asking themselves, is that if Moon is not doing well or not leading this team well in a meta that really appears to suit his strengths as a coach, then what happens when we have to move to a meta that is going to be reliant more on individual DPS skill? And I think that could be highly problematic for the Valiant overall. So they may want to make a decision now where they release him. Now, the converse of that is that Moon's been a coach who's been coaching for a long time. He is well respected within the scene, and there are a dearth of good coaching options available to Overwatch League teams. So I anticipate Moon will be picked up by somebody else relatively quickly. But giving somebody who we know is a strong leader, that we know, I think, in my observation, handles player interactions very well, I think maybe the solution might have been to hire some additional strategic coaches, although you could also argue that Packing 10, who is leading Angry Titans to top 2 finish in Europe contenders, should have been a guy who could have taught GOATs, very prominent meta in European contenders, to the players of the LA Valiant. Perhaps he was not allowed to. Maybe Moon wanted too much strategic control as well as sort of logistical and decision-making control over the team. And that could have hindered some of the strategic development that we could have seen from the assistant coaches like Dongsu, Packing 10, and Stoop. But really, I think it's interesting that they wouldn't try and make more strategic changes and keep him in control, maybe limit his say on the strategic end of things if that was causing a problem. Another issue that I think probably exacerbated this was, I imagine that the change with Kuki to support, the change with Kareev to DPS, and some of the roster changes that were made that I think were very questionable, probably were, at the very least, had to be signed off on by Moon, considering how much control the Valiant as an organization entrusted to him. And I think that they really didn't make good roster changes during the offseason. I think from a pretty objective point of view, there are some very large holes in skill in this roster that are not going to be fixed by even excellent coaching, and that the Valiant probably need to add a few more players to at least cover their weaknesses or to see if they can develop some new star DPS players over time. Some of the changes that were made were very good. Obviously, adding Izayaki. Izayaki was added in April of last year, but due to visa issues, was not actually able to play until this year. But he is a budding star at the flex support position. Space, obviously excellent. And Fate is a good tank, has been a little bit up and down, and presumably Custa is still going to be a valuable leader within this team's structure if he has a chance to play support again. So there are some really good pieces, I think, to this LA Valiant team, but the Valiant organization, as we saw last season, isn't above making massive changes mid-season in order to save themselves going forward. The big difference is that Valiant was an okay team before they made those changes and then turned into a good team by the end of the season. But the problem here is that they had an 0-7 start to the season. They haven't won a game and we're a quarter of the way into the league. And what that means is, even to get to 50% right now, they have to go 14-7 over the next 3 stages, which seems obviously very unlikely that you go from losing all your games to winning 2/3 of your games to get to 50%. And the goal has to be to by the end of stage 4, enter into the play-in tournament where the 7th through 12th teams, which is about as optimistic, I think, as you can really reasonably hope for from the Valiant right now, they'll get hot by the end of stage 4, squeak in at 10th place maybe, and then make a run for those last 2 playoff seeds and then make a run into the playoffs. That's what Valiant fans, I think, are going to be optimistic about as they look forward to the rest of this season, given these changes. But considering they haven't announced a new head coach yet and Packington is only interim, we don't really know what those moves are going to be, if we're going to see Custa come back, if we're going to see additional trades or player signings for this team. And I think there's sort of 2 ways that they could go about this in the future. One of them is to go with a full Korean roster, honestly. You make a decision to keep Kuki in or sign another Korean support. Maybe you trade for Closer from the Dallas Fuel and you trade Custa for Closer or something like that and try and make that trade. I don't know if Dallas would be willing to do that. And you trade space somewhere as well to try and get a flex tank in. Lots of people have suggested maybe trading space for Choi Hyobin from the San Francisco Shock. I think if you make those 2 deals and then you go to Korea and you scout some up-and-coming Korean DPS players and you go for an all-Korean roster, that could be an option. I think the other way you take this is that you go to Europe and you try and find some up-and-coming DPS players, and then you build the team specifically around a mixed language roster, focusing on Space and Izayaki. You keep Fate in there. You're still you put Custa back in, right? And then you try and buff up your DPS line with some additional options. So those are the 2 sort of branching paths that I see. Where they go for head coach, I don't really know at this point in time. Obviously, they may not even know. They might be doing some interviews as we speak when it comes to fleshing out the coaching staff, maybe hiring some additional analysts or assistant coaches as well to sort of pick up the load. But I think as we have seen over the season and now, even though a lot of these matches the Valiant lost were close and were winnable, like they didn't have to be 0-7 at this point in time. And I guess I'd criticize it a little bit in that, yes, they went 0-7 in this meta, but based on what we anticipate Blizzard making live in the new patch from what we see on the PTR right now, it's not unreasonable that the meta could shift drastically. The Valiant could figure out a way to be good at that meta. Again, like I said earlier, don't think it's likely, but could figure out a way to be good in that meta and at least give Moon another stage to show some level of improvement, because this seems like, we're only 4 weeks into the season right now, so it seems like not a lot of time was given to see if many of these changes were actually going to work out, especially when the Valiant said repeatedly that they really valued Moon as like a core part of the identity of this team, and we're looking forward to many years of working with him. So just a few things to consider from the Valiant's perspective. Hope that gives some depth of explanation and speculation to the roster moves made for Moon, and I'll see you for the next Monte's Musings.